We have two papers. One is my own on the constitutional turn in Douglas's thought. We also have with us Jennifer Spites-Benet, and she's going to be talking about the Freedmen's Memorial. I don't have pulled up the exact title of your paper. Jennifer,
that's okay. I'll give it at the beginning of my talk. But yes, it's Frederick Douglass and Nietzsche, both of them texts on memory and memorials. Yeah.
Okay, so what I thought I would do is we have only a few people here, 4 members in the audience. I never liked going to panels and just talking to people, whether there's 1 or 50 in the crowd. It's better to make it a little bit of a dialogue. So maybe you could, the 4 panelists, if you're in a position to unmute and turn on your video, if you could tell us maybe give us your name and where you're from and a little bit about your interest in ACTC.
Hi, I'm Greg Camp, out in Fresno, California. And sorry, I was just chowing down a little lunch. But really looking forward to this. And miss having been in Birmingham now this year, so.
Yes, I think we're gonna host it next year, but I'm not 100% sure. I think so.
Well, my sister's hoping so. She lives just south of you, so she would like us to come visit.
Right.
I'm Stephanie. I'm at Arizona State University in Barrett, the Honors College, and we have a core text sequence. And I've been coming to ACTC off and on for about 10 years, and I love it. I have so much to learn, and I use Frederick Douglass' narrative, and I want to use more or approach it differently and just continue to learn.
Hi, I'm Mark Taylor. I'm in London. I work in a high school, which Jen came to talk at, to visit, not to talk at. We have a lot of issues in East London, the same as you have, on memory and race. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in how they are dealt with by you Americans and how we might consider dealing with them in London. So I'm very interested to hear the papers. Thanks.
And I think Annie, a colleague of mine, introduced herself on the chat. She's not in a place where she can unmute, but she's a professor of history here at Sanford. Just had a book published. Okay, well, maybe Joseph Payne, who's with us, is also unable to unmute her video. So what I thought I would do for those, I'm assuming that you know who Frederick Douglass is, at least a little bit, and so that's why you're here as part of the panel. But I thought maybe a quick and brief history of some of the events in Douglass's life would be helpful to have on the table. So I'm sure you know that Douglass was born a slave in Maryland. He escaped around the time of his 18th birthday, although his exact birth date was unknown to him. Upon his escape, he married the woman Anne Murray, who assisted him in escaping. They had to move a couple of times in order to get as far away from the possibility of being captured and returned. She was free, but he was now a fugitive. What happens at this point is that Douglass begins to move in the circles of the abolitionist societies that exist in New England, first as a listener and then as a participant. He's tapped to speak and is a powerful speaker. At that point, Garrison and some others take him in under their wing, and they want him to publish his story as part of the push to make this vivid reality of slavery available to people, but also to show that Douglass, in a way, was defending, by producing his own autobiography, was defending his account, which was beginning to be questioned by some people who heard him speak and doubted whether or not a slave could rise to such oratorical success.
By publishing the narrative in 1845, he reveals enough about himself to be in danger of being captured and returned. So he travels to England. While he's there, arrangements are made to purchase his legal freedom, which means he has a chance then to return to the United States with at least a passport of some sort that allows him to demonstrate his status as a free man. He then relocates to the area where he will be for a long period of time, which is Rochester. He publishes a paper, several papers. The papers merge with other papers, change their name, but Douglas remains the primary voice within those papers. Of course, after the Civil War, when you have emancipation, Douglas is tapped by a succession of presidential administrations to hold federal positions that are that he's nominated for or commissioned for, and several of those he's the first African American to do so. He is appointed eventually as Marshal of the District of Columbia. He is moved to the area of DC, Anacostia by that point, where he lives with his wife Anna until she dies. Then he remarries, and in his last years, he serves as a kind of elder statesman and is appointed by President Benjamin Harrison to become minister to Haiti. That is something that he does for a short period of time. He returns eventually to DC, where he dies in 1895. So that's just a quick sketch of his career, hitting some of the highlights. I kind of left out the Civil War period and his engagement with Lincoln, which is also a fascinating topic, and their disagreements over colonization as a possible solution after emancipation. So I think maybe, Jennifer, why don't I go first chronologically and talk about the narrative a little bit, and then the 1852 oration, and then we'll get to the Freedman Memorial, which comes after. That sound all right? Okay, so I'm gonna try to time myself and read some of my paper. This is obviously part of a larger work, so I'm gonna shorten it a little bit. But before looking at the July 4th oration of 1852, it's important to remember something about Frederick's narrative and the way in which he comes to be free. There are a number of turns that occur within the narrative itself. Douglas vividly narrates and exposes, of course, the horrors and atrocities of slavery for his readers, but he also subtly conveys to them his path to freedom. And that path, of course, begins with his literacy. The determination of young Frederick to learn to read and write sets him on a course of liberation. His literacy is essential to acquiring the knowledge that would prove instrumental in forging and eventually fulfilling his desire to be free. But before he even could be animated by that desire to be free, he had to learn the language of liberty. And he learns that from this text that he's reading, the Columbian Orator. Now, the Columbian Orator itself is an anthology of great speeches. Some of them speak directly to him, such as the dialogue between master and slave, where the slave speaks to a reasonable master and attempts to persuade him that he should free the slave, which he successfully does. But in general, what young Frederick is acquiring by means of his reading of the Columbian Orator is self-knowledge, and the knowledge of his condition as a violation of his rights, his natural rights as a human being. The liberation of his mind from the shackles of ignorance and darkness precedes his desire to escape from slavery. The enlightening of his mind through the elevation of his thoughts is what animates his resolve to be free. The young Frederick comes to know himself once he begins to grasp that his worth as a human being is utterly irreconcilable with his enslavement. And not because his body is being treated brutally. In these chapters of the narrative, he's actually living a fairly good life, if you can put good in quotes. He's of course a slave, but he's well fed, he's dressed well, he knows many bodily comforts, in fact, more so than many of the poor white children who live in the same neighborhood with whom he shares his food because they have so little. And in exchange, they help him to learn to read and write. So it's the emancipation, though, of young Frederick's mind that opens the pathway from slavery to freedom. This liberal education, the liberation of his mind from bondage, prompts Douglas then in his first turn towards freedom in the narrative. Now, famously, skipping over a number of other events that occur, he eventually is brought back into the plantation slavery that many of the other members of his extended family are stuck in. And he encounters Covey and Covey's tyranny over him. Covey is a renowned breaker of slaves. Young Douglas at this point is not just an adolescent, but he's a young man, and he's very difficult for his master to deal with. So he sends him to Covey to work. Of course, this is a famous encounter where Douglas fights Covey over a lengthy period of time. But what is of interest, especially to me, and the way that Douglas presents this in the narrative, is that he first had to make another turn in his own thinking before he could prepare himself to fight Covey. And that's his freeing of his mind from the desire for self-preservation, that he makes a decision before he confronts Covey that no matter what happens, he will not be whipped again, even if it means resisting to the point of dying. So unlike some of the slaves that he sees around him who are finding ways to subordinate themselves to the master in such a way as to preserve themselves, he decides that fear of death is not going to limit him any longer. And once he makes that turn in his mind, he's able to confront Covey fully, but also with limits, which is to say he will resist Covey's tyranny and attacks with violence if necessary, but he doesn't seek revenge on Covey. So the turn allows him to see that there is something more important than just living. And that's being free, not entirely free, because of course fighting Covey does not win him his freedom, but he will be free from the fear of death that he sees causes other slaves to in a sense assist in their own enslavement. Ownership of his own mind then awakened him to the exclusive right to own his body as well. The courage to stand up for his right to be recognized as a man, as a person, even if not yet formally free, made possible his resistance to the brute-inducing as well as soul-killing effects of slavery. Those are Douglas's words, brute-inducing and soul-killing effects of slavery. Now, when he finally does escape, of course, there's a third turn that occurs, and I won't say too much about it, but I think the third turn in the narrative is his discovery of the importance of free labor, which is something that he realizes when he is allowed to work and to collect wages. He has to give the majority of his wages to his master, but he begins to understand the importance of enjoying the fruits of one's own labor, even if from a monetary point of view in a small way, but for him, it's crucial. Now, of course, the conclusion of the narrative is his description of his own escape and the difficulties, the dangers that were involved in his final escape to freedom. But I think the turns to freedom that occur prior to that are crucial in understanding what he called his path from slavery to freedom. So with that as a preface, this is what is known most famously about Douglas himself when he starts to move on the speaker circuit among the abolitionist societies in New England. And he's very much under the influence of William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and others of their ilk. And it's only with the 1852 oration, July 4th oration, that he begins to separate himself from the Garrisonian perspective. Now, the speech itself is delivered in Rochester, New York. It's delivered on July 5th, not on July 4th. Douglas makes clear that the reason for that is that in the South, the slaveholders would, quote unquote, celebrate July 4th by having slave auctions, and that African Americans who were free would refuse any association with those slave auctions on the 4th. And so he insisted that his speech his July 4th speech be delivered on the following day, July 5th. What I argue in the main section of this paper is that what we see here is not only Douglas in a really riveting rhetorical masterpiece where he is vividly bringing the horrors of slavery alive before the audience, the eyes of his audience, and implicating them in a kind of prophetic way. It's frequently spoken of as a kind of Jeremiad, where he is calling out to them their sins, that the audience, even though they are abolitionists and on the right side of history, they haven't done enough. They participate in other institutions, such as the Christian church in America, that hasn't done enough to distance itself from slavery. To turn to the oration itself, some of you will be familiar with it. If you've only ever taught the narrative, I would suggest among his other speeches, teaching, if you only have time for one, this is the one to teach, the July 4th oration. It follows very nicely after a reading and discussion of the narrative itself. The speech is divided up into explicitly two sections, the past and the present. So obviously the purpose of this ceremonial occasion is to celebrate the 4th of July, 1776, and the spirit of 1776. So he does talk initially about the past. I'll say something about that in just a second. But then he turns to the present and the question, what must be done now? And it's in this section where he really elaborates both the hypocrisies, he elaborates on the hypocrisies that he sees in America, and that includes in the North as well as the South. And he also calls out various institutions, the church especially in America, as aiding and abetting the continued existence of slavery in the South. Now, the opening, the first few paragraphs of his speech is a prologue where he lays out what he says is his task. But in the opening paragraphs, he's really just getting warmed up. It's a huge crowd. The crowd's got to settle down into some bit of silence after he's been introduced. The Declaration of Independence has been read in full for the audience before Douglas stands and makes his way to the podium to speak. At the beginning of the speech, he delivers what appears to be a kind of standard rhetorical device for self-deprecation, that he's saying he's not sure why he's been called to this task. The task is too much for his limited powers of speech. Of course, many in the audience have already heard him speak at other occasions. They've invited him to speak precisely because they know his powerful oratory is extremely moving. So there's something ironic about the way he refers to his quailing sensation before an audience of so many familiar faces. From a rhetorical point of view, you could write this off as just standard prologue sort of stuff, downplaying audience expectations in order to over-deliver when the speech actually comes. But what I think is that Douglas does have good reason to be a little bit vexed. Not only by the occasion, the importance of a July 4th celebration, the fact that he's the keynote speaker, it's a vast hall with a huge crowd, but he also is a little bit concerned about the speech itself, for only he himself knows exactly what he intends to say that day. Of course, he's been invited by the association, the Ladies Abolitionist Society of Rochester, because they expect him to say certain things along the lines of what he has been saying on the speaker circuit before. But the speech actually goes much further and in a direction that I think most of the audience does not anticipate. So the discussion of the past, I'll skim over that. He says, I'm here to talk to you about what happened with your fathers at the founding of your national life and your national career. He rhetorically stresses constantly the distance between himself and those he, in a sense, represents, and those fathers of yours, the ones who fought in the revolution in the name of liberty and freedom. Those are your fathers, and they fought for that which is now yours, he says. And they did so with pride and patriotism, and the audience should remember them. It's fitting that they remember their fathers with gratitude. But he does stress in this section the, quote, saving principles, end quote, that are contained in that resolution, that Declaration of Independence, which then forged the chain of, quote, your nation's destiny, but not mine, not his. Douglas exhorts the audience with rhetorical flair to, quote, stand by those principles, those saving principles. And he drives home the tragic irony of his critique with precision. Quote, be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, at whatever cost, end quote. Now, no one listening could have dodged the sharpened spear point of his rhetoric. These saving principles of liberty and justice are yours, he says. You have inherited them. Don't you abandon them now. In the ears of a friendly abolitionist audience, Douglas knows that he, at this point, has the crowd on his side, because of course the audience of abolitionists think of themselves as embodying the same spirit of liberty that was given to them by the revolutionaries of 1776, but now they are taking it even further to the emancipation of slaves. So he thinks he's got a friendly audience at this point. The censure implied of all those who deny these saving principles, the vicious enslavers in the southern states, as well as the weak-willed, he calls them Tories, among the Northerners now, the audience can be on Douglas's side and see that they're not the ones being criticized, but rather those in the enslavers of the South, as well as the so-called Tories in the North. His conclusion then to his opening remarks in the speech is this: a new nation with a Republican form of government, justly conceived in liberty on July 4, 76 years ago. Despite all odds, he says, your fathers declared themselves for freedom and independence, and they triumphed. So that's clearly the inheritance and the core principles that the abolitionists in the audience have inherited and are celebrating on this occasion. Now, he turns then to the present. In the discussion of the past, he distanced himself and his inheritance and his destiny from that of his audience. But he is willing to find common ground with the audience in the founding principles of the Republic, those saving principles that the generation of 1776 was fighting for. And he says, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this Republic. So he stops using the reference to your fathers and your founding, and he now speaks about the fathers of this Republic and these saving principles. And in contemplating the great deeds of the fathers of this Republic, he says one must admire the good that they did, and above all, the cause they fought for and the principles they contended for. And he says, I will unite with you to honor them. This means that he now is also a proud heir of that republic, or at least of a republic that is founded on devotion to principles of justice, liberty, and humanity. And in this respect, he shares an obligation with the members of the audience to celebrate in full union with them. So he is with them, but not of them, in a sense. The underlying critique, though, remains. He says, they believed in peace, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. Such men as they were, great in their day and generation, they set a glorious example in their defense of those eternal principles, standing out all the more by contrast, he says, with these degenerate times. In sum, regarding the past, and specifically with respect to the principles of the resolution and the Declaration of Independence, Douglas can declare his own admiration. Now, the epilogue of the speech, he concludes, has thus, enough has been said to praise the anniversary of July 4th. Celebrations of the day had taken place in all or almost all of the nation, in schools, households, by hearth fires, firesides, from the pulpit and from legislative assemblies. Enough has been said then, as ought to have been said, according to Douglas. So this is the epilogue to the first part of the speech. At this point, he says, "Let the dead past bury its dead," quoting lines from a poem. The living must act in the living present. And there's a clear shift in tone and purpose that the audience must have anticipated, which is we're not just here to celebrate the past, we're here to celebrate the past and its principles in the name of abolition in the present. It's not without purpose or without knowledge of his former condition and current arguments for abolition that the audience has come to hear him. He was chosen by the Anti-Slavery Society to sing the praises of the Declaration and its principles, the document that the increasingly brazen pro-slavery faction in the nation had begun to openly denounce as propagating self-evident lies. The abolitionists in Douglas's audience, fervent and lukewarm alike, knew well what to expect from his oration and which of the two founding documents they had all come to celebrate. The audience must quickly have surmised, and approvingly so, that Douglas would now pivot in his speech from celebration of the past and the principles of the Declaration to an extended exhortation of the present and the work of abolitionists to fight for a national embrace of all the Declaration's eternal principles: liberty and equality, freedom and justice, resistance to tyranny, and resistance to slavery. The audience, in other words, in this expectation, I would argue, were shockingly disappointed. This is not where Douglas goes with the speech. The shift in tone is clearly there. He says, "Fellow citizens, why am I called upon to speak to you here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in the Declaration of Independence extended to us all?" No, and the audience knows that. Whereas before he had seemed to find common ground for union in the Declaration's principles, Douglas now lays bare the unmeasurable distance that separates him from his audience. Due to the scourge of American slavery that desecrates with inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony that grand illuminated temple of liberty wherein are preserved those eternal principles. So he goes on to speak a little bit about the hideous rejection, the hideous and revolting way in which the nation, part of the nation, has rejected its past and those saving principles. But he goes on to say, America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false in the future. But why exactly is America false? He's not just denouncing the enslavers at this point. All of America is included in the denunciation. But the audience might wonder, are we not rightly celebrating the eternal principles enshrined in the Declaration with this July 4th celebration? Are not these principles essential to the abolition platform, demanding an immediate end to slavery and a new revolution against the tyranny of slaveholders? Douglas's answer is this: you've abandoned the true teachings of both the Bible and the Constitution. He then dispenses explicitly with all of the arguments of abolitionists that might be made in order to persuade slaveholders to emancipate their slaves. He says there's no moral suasion that will hold sway among the inhuman slaveholders whose inner conscience and moral compass has been destroyed by slavery itself. He now calls for something other than arguments: scorching irony, biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. The time, he says, has come for a rhetoric of fire, to rouse the conscience and startle the propriety of a nation, expose its hypocrisy, proclaim and denounce its offenses and crimes against both man and God. There's a very lengthy section where he now speaks about the sins of American Christianity and the way that it has supported the political crimes of the nation. But the end of the speech turns to an argument that I think is very surprising to his audience. Near the end, when he delivers a prophetic warning that the American Republic is on the verge of collapse because of the existence of slavery in the country, this, of course, is not a new diagnosis. The abolitionists' arguments have been about this all along. Every adherent to the cause of abolition acknowledges that slavery is the great sin. But the brilliance of Douglas's rhetoric is his turn here towards an embrace of the Constitution itself as enabling and guaranteeing that slavery, not as enabling and guaranteeing that slavery cannot be eradicated from the national body politic, but a turn towards the Constitution as the true remedy that alone can cure this fatal disease. Douglas's fiery vindication of the United States Constitution as an anti-slavery document, both in its spirit and in its letter, is delivered here as a lecture, presenting an ironclad argument in defense of his thesis. The Constitution, Douglas proclaims, when interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, is a glorious liberty document, something that's emphasized in the text of his speech by all caps, glorious liberty document. In order to refute those among the abolitionists who have slandered the framers of the Constitution and rejected the document as a diabolical pact with slavery, Douglas lays out the clear and self-evident principles of his constitutional interpretation, on the basis of which he has concluded that in the Constitution one finds, quote, principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery, end quote. His lessons in constitutional construction and interpretation are thorough and sound. He doesn't go into them at great detail in this speech, but he does elsewhere in his letters and some other speeches. His lessons are thorough and sound, and his conclusion a scolding refutation of all those who have willfully misread the Constitution, in his opinion. Their failure to grasp the true anti-slavery substance of the Constitution has led them to discard their most powerful weapon in the war against slavery. Without securing the principles of the Declaration within the framework of the Constitution and binding them inseparably together, Douglas argues, Republican government and the genius of American institutions cannot properly be understood. The Declaration, Douglas contends at the beginning of his oration, is, quote, the ring bolt in the chain of the nation's destiny. For the principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles, he said, be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes. But the Constitution, on the other hand, he now argues at the end of the oration, is the instrument by which those principles are preserved as a foundation upon which the form of government is erected and established. The Constitution establishes the constitutional framework that is the Republican means to preserve the natural rights and eternal principles of the Declaration that is brought into being itself to secure as the logic of the Declaration demands and the preamble of the Constitution announces. What is most shocking about this interpretation of the Constitution as an anti-slavery document, of course, is that it is directly opposed to that of William Lloyd Garrison and the Garrisonians, who have been declaring not only that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, but that it is impossible to continue with the Union under that Constitution that binds them to slaveholders who are really not susceptible to moral suasion, that the only possible means for eliminating this cancer, this disease from the body politic, is for them to separate from it, to amputate the southern slaveholding states, remove themselves from the Union, and to reform under a new constitution that is explicitly pro-slavery. Sorry, that is explicitly anti-slavery. Douglas, on the other hand, has decided that the Constitution as it is, both in its spirit and its letter, is already anti-slavery. The pro-slavery interpretation of the Constitution made it imperative, according to Garrison and his followers, for any moral person to engage in revolution, disunion. But Douglas, who has freed himself from the shackles of the Garrisonian view, denounces the Garrisonian view which denounced and rejected the Constitution. Douglas changes his reading and interpretation. He embraces the Constitution as the proper framework for Republican government, founded on the principles of natural right in the Declaration. He says, my position is now one of reform, not of revolution. As he argues in the July 4th oration, then the rules of interpretation by which to construe the Constitution warrant his reading of both of our founding documents as irrefutably anti-slavery. What is called for then is not outright revolution, as abolitionists like Brown and the Garrisonians preached, but fundamental reform, to bring the political action of the nation through constitutional means into accord with the principles of the Declaration. This, in conclusion, I argue, is the decisive turn to the Constitution as a glorious liberty document in this oration. Douglas here finds his prophetic voice, charting a new course in constitutional thought, which separated him from his former allies and supporters, the fervent Garrisonians, who in turn denounced him as a turncoat. But Douglas was determined to speak his mind with courage and suffer the blows of fortune as the besieged and brokenhearted suffering servant of the nation's fundamental principles for liberty and equality, as advocated in both of its founding documents, the Declaration and the Constitution. Douglas thus met the crisis of the modern republic in his time, not only with his majestic rhetoric, but with an intellectual revolution. The oration itself embodies that declaration. With his unwavering commitment to justice, liberty, and equality, Douglas confronted the crisis of his times, which is a crisis within the abolitionist movement. And he did so with a steadfast devotion to the natural rights principles of the Declaration, but also to the fundamental constitutional framework which could secure those principles. This is why I think of the oration as Douglas's own intellectual declaration of independence. Thank you.
I'm smiling and clapping for you.
Thank you. Do you want to go ahead, Jennifer, and then we'll just have plenty of time at the end for questions and conversation. Ooh, you have to unmute though.
All right, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I think it's a nice connection between these two papers. For obvious reasons, Douglas, and I'm going to be talking about an oration he gives a good bit later, 1876, I should know that, right? 1876, on the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. But I also have different interests. My discipline is geography. I'm kind of an urban historical geographer who thinks a lot about architecture and public space. And not surprisingly, that's worked me through a lot of the discussions going on right now about monuments and taking them down and augmenting them, and, you know, debates that are about the monuments, but they're often about so much more than the monuments, right? They're about ways of remembering the era of Jim Crow, about the way the Civil War is remembered. And so I'm not an expert on Douglas. I'm certainly not an expert on Nietzsche, but I do find these two texts enhance my work that I'm doing in my own discipline. All right, so here we go. Few would argue that Frederick Douglass and Nietzsche should not be a part of the Western canon. What can be difficult is selecting, as we've already heard, amidst slave narratives, books, essays, aphorisms, and of course, orations, which text we should have our students read. Likely students will read Douglass's oratorical marvel that you just shared with us and talked with us about, the meaning of the 4th of July, or the 5th of July, I now know. And perhaps Nietzsche's story of the madman, or perhaps an excerpt of Genealogy of Morals. I want to, however, in this COVID moment, in this post-George Floyd moment, amidst history wars, and of course, what Eric Doss calls memorial mania, I suggest two alternate texts by these thinkers. Excerpts from Nietzsche's 1873 essay on the use and abuse of history for life in Untimely Meditations, and Douglass's 1876 oration in memory of Lincoln. I forgot to share my screen with you, and I have typed up some of the quotes, so I'm going to do that now if you'll just let me know when it's working. You know, the thing about ACTC is that we never have, we never have technology, right? We're just sitting around a table and talking as only true scholars do. But I'm taking advantage of this opportunity this year because I always find it more helpful to read quotes as someone else is reading them along with them. Okay, so back to my paper. So the two texts, Untimely Meditations and the Oration in Memory of Abraham Lincoln. They were written only 3 years apart by two thinkers with very different geographies and dramatically different experiences. One, an escaped slave, abolitionist, orator, and it is often said the most photographed man of the 19th century. The other, Nietzsche, the hammering philosopher with chronic headaches, a short obsession with Wagner, a semi-recluse who spends the last decade of his life in catatonia. Though in dramatically different contexts, these two thinkers both argue for a critical discernment of history. They argue against holding up an archetype or ideal too quickly, and both agree that whatever the use of history, it must serve life. And for Nietzsche, that means cause action, facilitate creativity, and perhaps provide a glimpse of something beautiful. Nietzsche makes these arguments theoretically and explicitly, while Douglas does so rhetorically as he dedicates what we now call the Emancipation Memorial. Let's look at the texts first. All right. All right, can you see pictures of cows? Are we good? All right, so let me tell you a story first, and this comes from Nietzsche. A man sees a herd of cattle grazing in the field. As he watches the cattle, the man begins to feel envy because the beasts are happy, which is difficult for the man to accept because he considers himself better than the animal. However, there is something appealing about the way they eat, they rest, digest, play around all day, every day. They are not bored or sad as the man is regularly. Eventually, the man asks a cow, "Why are you looking at me and doing nothing? Why aren't you telling me about your happiness?" The animal wants to say, "I always forget what I was going to say." But he even forgets that this is what he wants to say. The man, however, cannot learn to forget, since he clings to the past and is therefore, like T.S. Eliot's Prufrock, a modern man paralyzed in the tension between past and future. For Nietzsche, this idealized, blissful animal existence is defined as living unhistorically, with no sense of time. Even though it is not a form of existence that is available to humans, he suggests the possibility of a happiness tied to forgetfulness and to living unhistorically. Humans, however, are destined to live with memory, a predicament involving not just the keeping and cultivating of memories of the past, but also the ability to leave behind and to forget, since Nietzsche says all acting requires forgetting, and he calls this active forgetting. This leads to the central thesis of the essay. Down here at the bottom of the screen, there is a point at which insomnia, rumination, or historical sensibility is harmful and ultimately fatal to living things, whether it be a human being, a people, or a culture. For Nietzsche, there are three modes of historical life. He refers to them as the three respects in which history belongs to the living: the monumental, the antiquarian, and the critical. Together, they depict three different ways in which life is simultaneously directed towards the past and the future. The corresponding future orientations are this. In the monumental mode, history should result in acting and striving based on heroism of the past. In the antiquarian, it should inspire preservation and venerating heritage. In the critical, this is for the suffering and the oppressed who are seeking liberation. For Nietzsche, none of them are intrinsically better than the other, and they can all be both enhancing and detrimental to life depending on the situation. Nietzsche then goes into detail about how each mode of history works, but they all must be moderated, and we must know the limits of each. And all, and he says this multiple times again and again, all must be in the service of life. Not sure what he means by that, but he says it continually. Now on to Douglass. On the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination in 1876, Frederick Douglass gave a speech at the unveiling ceremony of the Freedmen's Monument. At the Freedmen's Monument in Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C. The monument, named to acknowledge that it was funded solely with donations from freed Black men and women, depicts Lincoln holding a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation while standing over a kneeling Black man with broken chains. So this monument received a lot of attention last summer because people obviously want it taken down, and they're taking issue with the way the slave is portrayed on his knees. They're pushing back against the context and the presentation of emancipation. All right, so back to Douglass in 1876. At such an auspicious moment, with an audience of nearly 25,000 people, Douglass, between tepid platitudes about the beauty of the monument, offers a scathing critique of Lincoln and the emerging myth surrounding his legacy. He says, "We claim for ourselves no superior devotion to the character, history, and memory of the illustrious name whose monument we have here dedicated today. Truth compels me to admit, even here in the presence of the monument we have erected to his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, in his prejudices, he was a white man. He was ready and willing at any time during the first years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity and the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people in this country." And yet, Douglass follows his critique with praise for Lincoln and his unyielding commitment to fidelity to union and liberty. And if you know anything about Douglass's relationship with Lincoln, the idea is that he eventually comes around, right? Fidelity to union and liberty. Though Lincoln was both hated and beloved during his presidency, Douglass argued, he was a complicated man whose assassination, though, quote, this is Douglass, a new crime, a pure act of malice, filled the country with a deeper abhorrence to slavery and a deeper love for the great liberator, unquote. Douglass's simultaneous praise and criticism of Lincoln and his cautionary message to the audience surprises me. It surprises us with its complexity, its nuance. Consequently, the monument is rendered more complex and nuanced. In one speech that day, he appears to be speaking to all three modes of Nietzsche's use of history. He will not celebrate the Lincoln of 1865 without first remembering the pain of 1861, as well as the centuries of slavery prior. Douglass states that we must have a comprehensive view, quote, in the stern logic of events and in view of the divinity that shapes our ends, that the hour and the man of our redemption had somehow met in the person of Abraham Lincoln. Perhaps the most memorable aspect of the day, Douglass argues, is that for the first time, Black citizens commissioned and paid for a public monument. It was erected in public space. They gathered in public space and dedicated it with the words of a Black man who is offering an uncomfortable critique of a man whose figure was set in the monument itself. Such an event was unimaginable a decade prior. Douglas hopes the statue will empower Black Americans to define Lincoln's legacy for themselves. Quote, "In doing honor to the memory of our friend and liberator, we have been doing highest honors to ourselves and those who come after us." Douglas's comments here are prescient and they are profoundly insightful. He knows what Nietzsche knows. The historical and the unhistorical, remembering and forgetting, are necessary in equal measure for the well-being of a single individual or of a people or of a culture. Douglas is using what Nietzsche calls the plastic power of history to develop beyond ourselves, to incorporate what is past, what is strange, to heal wounds, replace what is lost, and to recreate broken forms. He is critical of the monumental history emerging around Lincoln's legacy, which will go on to be contested well into the 20th century and, you know, perhaps even now, but certainly well into the 20th century, culminating in the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall in DC. Douglas understands that monuments to great men, while set in stone, are ultimately about what we make of them in years to come, and that those understandings are made of shifting sand. Douglas anticipates the monument wars of the past century, which, as you know, have dramatically intensified in the past few decades. Even 2 days after giving that same speech we just looked at, 2 days later, Douglas writes a letter to the newspaper in which he says, we need to look at the space again. And he actually is pushing for another monument. And he's just trying to get the conversation going. If you look at this slide here, admirable as is the monument by Mr. Ball in Lincoln Park, it does not, as it seems to me, tell the whole truth. And perhaps no one monument could be made to tell the whole truth of any subject which it might be designed to illustrate. Okay. Later in his life, Douglas, not too much later, about 10 years later, a little less, later in his life, Douglas will speak out against the dozens, perhaps hundreds of Confederate memorials erected to reinforce the lost cause narrative of the Civil War. Robert E. Lee will be venerated in stone again and again, perhaps as a counterpoint to Lincoln. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, 312 Confederate symbols, that's monuments, iconography, flags, so 312 Confederate symbols have been removed or replaced since the Charleston, South Carolina shooting in 2015. Of those 312, 167 were removed in the 8 months following the death of George Floyd in 2020, more than those removed during the previous 5 years. And it's ongoing. Some states have passed preservation laws prohibiting the removal of any monument older than 50 years. One state, my own, is considering a bill prohibiting the recontextualizing of a monument with additional signage, offering an opposing or a contextual view on the meaning of the monument. Debates are ongoing. You know this, you read the news. Cities are removing them, replacing them, augmenting them. And yet, as one journalist eloquently states, here we are in the 21st century fighting about monuments put up in the 20th century about a 19th century war. Recently, I was asked to write an essay about the emerging landscape of empty pedestals. As all of these monuments are coming down, their pedestals are often left in situ, waiting to be removed, or perhaps to support a new hero deemed venerable these days. Who knows why? With the COVID quarantine, cities' budgets are tight and grounding down a block of concrete doesn't seem urgently. Interestingly, while 2020 protests after George Floyd have worked to remove these monuments, the COVID-19 quarantine situation has actually slowed down the replacement process. For someone who studies the material landscape, empty pedestals represent time between tearing down and building up. It's an interruption in the landscape, arguably more effective than a frantically erected replacement. And they offer cultural space to reflect on the human need to both construct monuments and to tear them down. At this moment in time, perhaps even we can ask if the present iconoclasm is accomplishing what we hoped or what is intended. Contemplating the empty monuments in his and my hometown, New Orleans, author Walter Isaacson writes, and he's talking specifically about this monument on the left here, which is the Robert E. Lee monument that was in the middle of New Orleans. It is at a place of privilege in the middle of the city. It distinguishes between uptown and downtown, and now it is empty. And so you see that shot to the far left of the pedestal standing empty. Walter Isaacson, a native New Orleanian, he writes, with each viewing of the Lee Memorial, the empty pedestal of Lee, from each new vantage, I am struck by how evocative and moving and memory-provoking the current poignant void has turned out to be. It has become a piece of public art, a piece of found art. It memorializes a moment when we as a city had a long and difficult discussion, then lived to remember the tale. And he's talking about the discussion of tearing it down. The vacant monument captures that moment and more. Whatever side of the debate you're on, each new viewing evokes not only the thoughts you had at the time, but also your evolving feelings as time passes. You might even be second guessing some thoughts you had. Either way, it makes the current non-monument into a living and breathing memorial and an unintended artistic statement. Could these empty spaces, in fact, be monuments to the complexity of history and the pursuit of understanding it? I think for Nietzsche, this would be in service of life. And that is it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have clapping hands from.
Thank you,
Jennifer.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Can I ask you to could you say again how you understood the three different meanings of history for Nietzsche to be in Douglas's speech?
Well, he's talking about the three categories are monumental and antiquarian and critical. All right. And so remember, for Nietzsche, all of these must be in service of life. And that's important, particularly with critical. And I'll explain why in just a second. So I just want to get my notes. So monumental history, it's active, it's powerful, it's looking for heroes and models, anything from the past that enhances the concept of human potential, right? If greatness was possible once, it's possible again. So in that sense, I think Douglas is giving Lincoln his due. I think he knows Lincoln is going to be put on many, many, many pedestals from here on out. He knows the Lincoln legacy is in formation and is going to happen. And I think for the most part, he approves of it. I mean, I think he says that again and again in his oration. But he's also, sometimes subtly, he's also telling us to be careful about that. In his criticisms of Lincoln, he's saying, be careful, be careful. And he goes on to articulate that even more when he talks about whether or not there should be an additional monument in that space. Antiquarian is who preserves and venerates. There's something about the past that we want to hold on to for future generations. Veneration of the past should provide a feeling of pleasure and satisfaction. And I think this one is a little bit more difficult to see in Douglas's oration, but I guess, and to your comments about the July 4th talk, he's very much aware that he is part of making history. Mm-hmm. And he's saying this again and again. And I think he's very interested in getting the record right, because he knows this is a past that's going to be venerated. And then finally, critical history, it takes tremendous strength, Nietzsche says, because you have to break up and dissolve the past. You have to put the past on trial. For Nietzsche, every past can be condemned, but you have to figure out if it's how to do that and when it's necessary. And this is when his concept of forgetting comes into play. He said, if you're gonna live with this, you're gonna have to learn how to forget some things. He says it takes a great deal of strength to live and to forget the degree to which life and injustice are often one and the same. All right. So to me, his writings about critical history are so poignant because, one, it must always be in the service of the present or for life, as he keeps saying. And he goes on to really poke fun at academics like us. He's saying, you know, in everything we do, we've been taught to be critical, and yet we're stuck in the mire of criticism. We're kind of trapped, right? Trapped in the swamp. And he's incredibly critical of that. And that's often how Nietzsche explains his decision to leave academy and, you know, things like that. Professors are often in his target. So those are the way. So Douglas, of course, is offering a critical history. I mean, that's the most obvious to me, right? Is that he's saying, okay, I'll honor Lincoln, but I'm going to take you back to 1861. I'm going to take you back to before. We're not going to forget that. And then he'll go on to say that again and again and again. You know, he speaks out a lot against these lost cause memorials that are going to really kick in 1890, 1900, 1910. Of course, he'll be dead by then. But, you know, he calls these monuments to fools, not the Lincoln one, but the lost cause one. He says they're monuments to fools. And I mean, again and again, he says, we cannot forget what Robert E. Lee stood for. We cannot forget what these people did. And so there's this idea of revisiting history for the purpose of remembering it, but also moving past. So, I don't know if that answered your question, but it
I did, because I was following your you had the quotations of the 3 different understandings of history. And I was thinking, okay, how does that apply to the 1852 July 4th oration? Obviously, the celebration of the deeds of the glorious generation of 76, that's the monumental history. That's the purpose for the ceremony itself. You have this problem that it could slip into just being antiquarian.
Yep.
Now, because it's an abolitionist audience, they're not simply doing that. They see themselves as continuing and acting on the example of the founding 1776 generation. But he's critical of it, right? Because they haven't yet learned how to forget enough to act in the present. And what they need to do in the present is going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Partly reject aspects of Christianity that they've been taught from the pulpit, but also they have to reject what looks like the great icons of the movement, and that's going to be John Brown and Garrison himself, because they reject the Constitution. And he's saying, but you can't do that. You have to stick. So you have to have more of a critical understanding of the past. Mm-hmm. Their reading of the Constitution is wrong, meaning they've misread the past. You need to read the past more carefully. So I was sort of seeing that in your speech, the one that you're dealing with. I mean, that it seems to fall into a similar pattern, I think, that we both celebrate Lincoln, but we're also critical of Lincoln. And what we don't want to do is slip into an antiquarian veneration, either of Lincoln or of Lee.
Right.
Lost cause is the Lee veneration. The idea that Lincoln did enough and that, you know, why do you want more? Mm-hmm. That's the veneration of Lincoln that caused problems for the creation of the Lincoln Memorial.
Right.
Yeah. If there's more work to be done, don't celebrate yourselves too much for what Lincoln did.
correct. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think this is the first, and somebody may know this, and I know exactly which book I could use to look it up. But I think this memorial, the Emancipation Monument, is the first monument to Lincoln at a national scale. So like you have towns in Illinois and you have, places all around that have changed school names to Lincoln and streets and, all that stuff. But you really don't get a national push really until the 1920s and 30s when the big Lincoln Memorial on the Mall comes into play.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's the first federal federal monument that is devoted to Lincoln. And I do know that the Lincoln Memorial Project began at this time, at the time of the speech, because they were planning something larger. It just took decades for them to get around to figuring out how to do that.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know, though, if it was originally intended to be so grand, because my understanding is that the legacy of Lincoln was still incredibly volatile. Like, I mean, the understanding of Lincoln's legacy was incredibly volatile.
Yeah, no, I don't think they envision it looking the way that it does look. That comes after the City Beautiful movement at the turn of the century. But I know they were already, they're trying to finish the Washington Monument. That's taken forever. And they're getting to the point in the late 1870s where they're going to finish it. And I think there's talk, in addition to this small statue group, there's talk of we need one for Lincoln too. But they have no vision of it in the form that we see it now. But yeah, thank you very much. How about we just open it up to questions for either one of us? Or about either aspect of Douglas and or Nietzsche to the audience.
I have a probably oversimplified question for this group, but Jennifer, I just want to be sure I heard you correctly, that the monument you were discussing was paid for by Black freed slaves. And so presumably they had some choice in what the piece of art looked like. No, that's unfortunate, because when this did come up in the news recently, I remember thinking that, yeah, I can see the side that thinks that it looks bad, but I guess for me it would have just been nice if they'd maybe had a slave in chains on one side of Lincoln and then like a little mini arc of time on the other side, somebody standing up equal with him, something that shows we have this terrible part of our past so that we don't forget we're capable of oppression, but that we're also capable of challenging ourselves and changing the bad things that we do so that we can be more equal. But I guess I just don't understand the politics of that, how they paid for it but didn't have a hand in it. And if you've read anything that would suggest what they would have preferred it look like.
So I highly recommend Kirk Savage's work on this issue. He has a book, Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves, and there probably a third of the book is just about the Emancipation Memorial, which was called the Freedman's Memorial.
You hold that up again?
Yeah, sure. And I'm happy to email you.
Thank you.
Sorry. It's Kirk Savage.
Okay.
Who does great stuff on monuments and memorials. And he takes through the whole, there was a competition. But basically, as soon as the Black Americans give the money, it's sort of relinquished to a committee, a formal committee that's of course all white, and it's artists and philanthropists, and there's a competition, and this is what's chosen. Savage shows you the other options. None of them, I think, would really meet what you're saying. But the other thing is that in 21st century eyes, the position of the slave kneeling, his chains being broken, that's incredibly offensive. But there is an argument that what was trying to be done was a duplication of the Wedgwood it was a Wedgwood plate, a Wedgwood saucer metal thing that was sold for the abolitionist cause. Some people think they were trying to duplicate that, but there's some great history about it. There's a great history about the model, the person who actually was the model for the statue.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say if you go, you can Google that image that
Mhm.
you're referring to of the rising slave being freed from his chains. I actually have done a lot of work on that particular monument because I take students to DC and we read Frederick Douglass and then we talk about the monument. But it's difficult to see the monument in the eyes of a freed person in 1876. I mean, we see it now after a century of failures in the progress towards full equality. But I think Savage mentioned some of the letters from those who contributed and then from those who were first reacting to the monument, and just the sheer idea of seeing someone who looks like you in bronze up on a pedestal, regardless of what position he's in, was to them overwhelming. And when you stand in front of the monument itself, you get a fuller sense of the power of the body of the freedman. That if he stands up, he's going to be way bigger than Lincoln. It's quite clear, and the fullness of his body, but also the way his head is up.
Yep.
So he's not, even to call him kneeling doesn't make any sense because he's clearly standing up, not kneeling down. So yeah, it's just, it's when you see it 100 years later and with the intervening history and our attention to monuments, which Savage talks about in his other book, The Monument Wars. We just have an entirely different relationship with monuments now after the Vietnam Memorial than
Right, correct, yeah.
We can't go back and think about it as monumental any longer. It always has to be a narrative that it somehow is accounting for the failures as well as the successes.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be, and that you're starting to see more memorials to ideas or, for in New Orleans, my hometown, what to replace Lee with, the biggest thing that I've heard is a memorial to the victims of Katrina, and it will be non-figurative. It's not going to have the human form. So it'll be interesting to see if that comes to fruition. I don't think there's any money. I don't think there's any political will right now for it, but
yeah. But in general, the move away from figural representations and from a so-called great man theory of the past, that you have to memorialize ideas or collective groups. It's really hard to visualize that in a three-dimensional form.
Right.
If you're interested in that, I don't know, Jennifer, if you know the signers of the Declaration of Independence monument in DC. It's really strange, and it's in a small location. It's along the pond, not the reflecting pool, but next to the reflecting pool, there's the Constitution Pond.
Yeah.
But there's a monument to the signers, and sorry, not the signers of the Declaration, signers of the Constitution, and it's non-figural. It's easy to miss because it's down low, sort of at your feet, but it's worth taking a look at because it's attempted to solve the problem of what happens when you remove human figures, but still have to convey some sense that human beings were involved here.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's worth looking. How about other questions from the audience?
Jennifer, I may have zoned out a little bit as you were talking about Nietzsche, but his definition of doing this for life, does he give a little better idea of what for life would? Because it seems to me that an antiquarian is thinking that life is one thing, whereas the other categories are going to think it's something else. How do we define what life really should promote?
Well, I will say I think that's an evolutionary concept for Nietzsche. And if people know Nietzsche better than me, oh my gosh, please speak up, because I am way out of my depth here. But we eventually get to Nietzsche's Superman and where he goes at the end of his writing career. But there's this focus on sort of living life to the fullest and being strong and be sort of radically individualistic. I'm wondering if when he talks about for life, he's kind of in the early stages of that idea. He doesn't define it, there's no clear definition of it, but he's talking about creating something new. There are other times when he uses the phrase, it needs to be creative, it needs to be present, because again, there's this idea of forgetting, being unhistorical or historical, right? Humans are condemned to be historical. But if we're going to use history, hence the title of the essay, if we're going to use history for Nietzsche, it has to be for something now, for something forward.
This conflict came to me a few years ago when I was had a group of students in Istanbul, and we were going through the Hagia Sophia. And of course, it's gone from a Christian cathedral to a mosque to a museum, and now back to a mosque. And I asked one of the students, so you're in charge of the curation of this place. What do you destroy in order to uncover, or what do you leave covered for? These are choices you have to make when monuments take on, or any physical space, right, takes on multiple layers of meaning.
Right.
These are choices we make about, well, whose life, whose definition of what we're trying to create here, and
Sure.
what's it doing for us?
Yeah, that's a great point. One generation's passion is another generation's curse. So it's hard to do that well.
Certainly the Hagia Sophia, if you add to it the even preceding layer of it being a Roman basilica, and then Constantinian, it's so the question of what is the use of the past in the present, if the present isn't connected to that past any longer.
And often just the recycling of materials, so that you have an ancient temple, then you have the basilica, then you have the mosque, then you have a museum, then you have, and part of it's just the sheer physicality that you often just recycle places and materials, and weave it into something new. There's something beautiful about that too, where you're keeping a past and bringing it forward, almost like starter dough, right? You're always keeping something and moving it on.
Yeah,
well,
I think
that's why the situation, what we've seen happening in Syria in particular, but any kind of time that cultural artifacts are destroyed with like a vengeance, it's so, I think it's so debilitating to see. Yeah,
I like the starter dough is a nice way of thinking about the antiquarian historian, that you do need someone to remember it. The problem is when you fetishize it and venerate it because it's old, and then you just need to put it in glass and stare at it, unmoving and dead. You're as dead as the object is that's being venerated. But on the question of what it means to live, I think that Nietzsche gives some account of that, for example, in The Birth of Tragedy, that the rationalism, the Apollinian, somehow it constrains life, right? Because it thinks too much rather than being just an expression of and sort of over exuberant and abundance of living. It thinks too much. And of course you could take something like Zarathustra, the thus spoke Zarathustra as a model for what that living would look like. But even Zarathustra has to make his way through these different sort of ossifications of past traditions that he's got to break them, but he's got to work his way through them and not be caught by them.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those might be
tragedy. It's fantastic. It's just so uncharacteristic of what follows with Nietzsche. It's.
Yeah.
But when he's talking about monumental history, he does. Oh no. I'm sorry. I just taught Nietzsche this week, so I guess it was Genealogy of Morals. Where he does advocate for the Greeks. When he's about to start talking about the slave morality of Christianity, he stops and takes a moment for the Greeks.
The the Greeks had their problem, but they were still better than Christians in that regard. So he can be critical of the Greeks and the birth of tragedy, but it's nothing like being critical of the Christians later.
No.
Yeah, we have still about 9 more minutes before the session ends. Do you have other questions on any of these topics?
I'm curious how your students who come, perhaps you have students who come from different parts of the country react to this. Being in California, I always say we have no memory. Being on the West Coast, it's our history is so limited in sense of human history that we've memorialized here. So that even going to the East Coast, let alone some other place in the world, is a trip back in time that is so different. How do your students from different parts of the country react to what you're talking about?
Well, I will say overwhelmingly our students are from the Southeast, but they do come from all over. And as you know, this issue of Confederate memorials is not it's not just a Southern phenomenon, right? It's all over the country. So there's that. But in terms of, so I'm thinking about the American landscapes class I teach. I'm thinking about some of my geography stuff where I do a lot with public space. I think in terms of, I think they have never thought about space in this way, place or space, that it's got power interwoven into it. The decisions that are made are all sort of made by, with certain agendas in mind. And so I think it helps them understand the monument issue better, because I think from the outside or an unreflective perspective, they're just like, what's the deal with all the monuments, which in some ways you could argue it is a distraction from the real questions. But again, if you think of that built material landscape as holding power, right? And tensions between those who have power and those who don't, then it starts to make a lot more sense. I'm sure that there are students here at Samford, lots of conservative, lots of evangelical students at Samford. It's a faith-based institution. I'm sure that there are some that think it's all ridiculous, but it doesn't come out in my class. I think one, because I don't let it, but two, I'm sorry to say that, that's horrible. But two, I think it's because of the way I frame it, right? I take it from the perspective of material culture first, then ideas second. I don't know if that made sense. But.
So, Greg, did you want to respond, or can I jump in? I don't want to trample over.
No, you can. Welcome to respond. I was also thinking of Dustin saying that he can take his students over to the Washington Memorial. It's like, yeah, I wish. Sorry, that would cost me a lot of money to get students there.
Well, Birmingham's a great place to do this because there's just so much good stuff happening with, interesting, I say, the removal of the Confederate Memorial in our big park. The preservation law that Alabama has passed is 50 years, anything that's older than 50 years, which means all of the civil rights memorials can be taken down, but none of the Civil War memorials can. So there's all kinds of good drama in local politics with it. But it's all embedded in, I think, this kind of, it's embedded in politics, left-right politics, Southern identity.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to ask about. Could you say more about this proposed bill to not allow additional signage? Because to me, that's a way of sort of honoring the part of our history that wants to honor certain things, even if it's bad. That in itself is historically interesting. Look at how much we wanted to honor Robert E. Lee. But adding additional signage that says, while he was revered for this reason, he's reviled for these reasons, and here's some contextualization. To me, that could educate everybody walking by there and leave it up, but make it more worthwhile. I don't know why this isn't happening, and it blows my mind that they're trying to prevent it from happening.
Well, just look at the issues of the 1619 project and the 1776 commission, right? So Trump Trump has the 1776 Commission, and academics and others have been critical of the 1619, but they're kind of pushing against each other in many, many ways. To rewrite history or to contextualize history is kind of code for a leftist agenda, I think, at least in Alabama. And so, yes, there is a bill. I don't think it's going to go anywhere based on what I've read. I think it's more of an issue of getting it on the record of this, no additional signage added. I think it's going to die, but we do have a preservation law about the 50 years. So in a lot of places, it does get to happen. I mean, a lot of places are doing some really interesting stuff. So, not to bore you too much, but what I'm doing with my geography research is we're actually looking at different methods of community-based planning that facilitate this process of how do you shape these public spaces with historical context that speaks to everyone, not everyone, but at least the representation of the city itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I understand what you're saying, and if they took down the original sign and put up a completely brand new one, that's rewriting history. But if you leave the original sign and add something,
right,
that to me, it's not exactly rewriting. Have either of you explored anything with augmented reality? We had a little project at ASU where we were trying to go around and embed these codes in the ground where that when people put their phone over them, different pictures across time and history could come up to show different cultural perspectives or how that place changed over time.
Oh, that's fascinating. So we don't have anything like that here. I've used something similar in Rome that you can walk around and you can see things fully constructed and phases of destruction, I guess. But that's very interesting.
Well, it is. It's just very hard to implement, and the group that's been working on it has faltered. So I don't know where it's at right now, but I was in the original year's worth of planning stuff on that. But yeah, given what you're interested in, maybe you could partner with somebody.
Sure.
Yeah, it's hard, Jennifer, the reconstruction of Rome that you're talking about, it's less disputed, right? So it solved the problem was raised by Greg, which, okay, in order to get to the imperial stuff, you're going to have to rip up all the medieval stuff. But I want to keep the medieval stuff, but that means you got to rip up the Renaissance stuff to get to it. So you solve that problem to some degree by layering in this, visual form, and you can teach all of those different ages in that space using the virtual reality. But nobody really is disputing about the facts of these historical layers. Whereas I think what Stephanie's talking about is disputed accounts of how to understand the past from the perspective of different communities. Then it becomes a lot harder to know how to adjudicate the layering. It's a lot easier, I think, if you've got you've got stratigraphy in mind. You don't really have over on the other side. You have something like ideological disputes, and how do you layer them or present? It's
that palimpsest idea, right? That we just kind of layer on and over. And you're right. Some cities don't have to deal with it in the same way. Rome is a great example. London's a little different though, because London is such a global 21st century city, and yet it has Roman ruins and lots of stuff in between. So the controversy for London is always, where can you build something new? And the answer to that question is almost nowhere.
Well, the answer in Rome is never anywhere.
That's right.
Well, I think we should bring the panel to an end, in part because I think the recording session needs to end, and people may be going to other panels. So
thank you so much. It was
nice.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Being recorded. Where is this going to be available?
They picked it up in the agenda. near where
Yeah,
you?
it has been being recorded, and it should be in the next day or two, the same place where you click join live stream, there'll be a link saying like view recording or something like that.
And how long will this be up?
That's what I was going to ask, because I don't have time to listen to them all while school's wrapping up.
Yeah, I'm not really sure about that. Charlie Thomas is the person to ask about it. She's the one who's uploading the recordings, but I would imagine by the end of the conference, she's going to tell us all that on her own. So maybe give it a couple of days, and if you don't hear one way or the other, shoot her an email.
And I don't think we filled anything out about permission to do that. I mean, I don't care for me, but I'm wondering, you know, with our students, we have to be so careful when we're recording class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right. And she's told us that if anyone has any sort of issue with the recording happening or going up, she's more than happy to nix the recording. So if you do have an issue, email her and she will solve it.
All right.
Thank you all.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Great.